Some people value things, Emma, but what matters is the story behind them. My grandfather's words echo in my mind as I stand in my empty attic, staring at the bare shelves where his collection once lived. 4 generations of Wilson family. History. Gone in an afternoon while I was at work. The vintage pocket watches, the handcrafted tools, everything. Vanished. All that remains are the tiny cameras I installed after things started disappearing months ago. Cameras my mother-in-law. Barbara never noticed when she decided my family's legacy wasn't worth keeping. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who installs security cameras in their own home. But when you marry into a family like the Parkers, you learn to protect what's yours. My name is Emma Wilson Parker, and 6 months ago, I had everything. A loving husband, a beautiful home in Pine Ridge, and a collection of family heirlooms that told the story of the Wilson family going back to the Civil War. Ethan, something's missing again, I told my husband one evening in March, holding up an empty display case that had previously housed my great-grandfather's railroad pocket watch. Ethan sighed, running his hand through his dark hair. Emma, are you sure you didn't just move it? You've been reorganizing the attic for weeks now. I shook my head, frustration building. I know exactly where everything is. This is the 3rd item that's disappeared this month. First, it was Grandpa Henry's carved pipe, then the silver compass, and now this. Maybe we should change the locks, Ethan suggested half-heartedly, though I could tell he didn't really believe anything was wrong. That night, as Ethan slept, I ordered a set of tiny cameras, the kind you'd never notice unless you were looking, for them. Call it paranoia, but something told me I needed proof before making accusations. The Wilson family treasures weren't particularly valuable in terms of money, but they were irreplaceable to me. Each item told a story, carried a memory of the people who had held them before me. 2 weeks later, I finally caught something on camera. Barbara Parker, my mother-in-law, wandering through my attic while I was at work, examining items with a critical eye, occasionally slipping smaller pieces into her purse. Just borrowing them, she later claimed when I confronted her with the footage. To have them appraised for insurance purposes. For my own good, of course. I wanted to believe her. Family is complicated, and the Parkers had welcomed me despite my humble origins, as Barbara liked to remind people at every opportunity. So I gave her the benefit of the doubt, despite the twist in my stomach that told me something wasn't right. I'll bring everything back next week, she promised with that perfect smile that never quite reached her eyes. I just want to make sure you're properly insured, dear. Some of these old things might actually be worth something. I should have trusted my instincts. It was Ashley, my sister, who suggested I keep the cameras running. Emma, this isn't normal behavior, she insisted over coffee at the Lakeside Cafe, our weekend ritual since childhood. Who goes through someone else's belongings without asking? She's just particular, I defended weakly. You know how she is about appearances. Ashley rolled her eyes. Yes, I know exactly how Barbara Parker is about appearances. The woman refers to your Craftsman house as charming, like it's an insult. She wasn't wrong. Barbara had been dropping hints about our starter home for years, suggesting we move to the same upscale neighborhood as the rest of the Parkers. The fact that Ethan and I loved our home, with its creaky wooden floors and stained glass windows, seemed irrelevant to her. Just promise me you'll be careful, Ashley urged, squeezing my hand. I don't trust her. I should have listened. The items Barbara borrowed never came back. When questioned, she claimed she'd left them with her personal appraiser and would retrieve them soon. Weeks passed. Excuses multiplied. Then came the day everything changed. May 15th. I remember it clearly because it was the anniversary of Grandpa Henry's passing. I'd taken the day off work to sort through his letters, a yearly ritual that helped me feel connected to him. But an emergency at the hospital where I work as a nurse pulled me away. A multi-car accident requiring all hands on deck. I was gone for 6 hours. The cameras caught everything. Barbara arrived at 11:42 a.m. using the spare key we'd given her for emergencies. She wasn't alone. Walter Reed, owner of Reed's Antiques, followed her up to the attic. The footage still makes my blood boil when I watch it. "As you can see, Walter, they're just gathering dust up here." Barbara's voice came through clearly on the recording. "Emma hardly ever looks at them, and with the family reunion coming up, wouldn't it be lovely to clear out this space for a proper guest room?" Ethan agrees it's time to let go of all this clutter. Walter moved through the room, examining pieces with professional interest. "Some of these pieces are quite remarkable, Mrs. Parker. This set of woodworking tools, for instance, they appear to be pre-1900. And these military medals." Yes, Barbara waved dismissively. Emma's grandfather was quite the collector. But really, what use are they now? Just taking up space and collecting dust. "I can offer you a fair price for the collection," Walter said, pulling out a checkbook. "But shouldn't your daughter-in-law be here for this transaction?" Barbara's laugh still sends chills down my spine. "Oh, Emma trusts me completely with these matters. Besides, she's mentioned wanting to redecorate this space. I'm just helping move the process along." The check Walter wrote was for $3,800, fraction of what the collection was worth, even in purely monetary terms. But Barbara seemed pleased, helping him carefully pack everything into large storage boxes. My family's history, generations of memories, loaded into a stranger's van in less than 2 hours. The only things they left behind were a few framed photographs and items too large to carry easily. Even Grandpa Henry's recipe book, filled with not just recipes, but family stories, pressed flowers, and handwritten notes from 4 generations of Wilsons, was deemed worthy of disposal. I didn't discover what had happened until I returned home that evening, exhausted from my shift, only to find the attic stripped nearly bare. The cameras had captured it all, but that was cold comfort, as I stood among the empty shelves, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had been taken from me. When I called Ethan sobbing, his response shattered me almost as much as the theft itself. "Mom mentioned she was helping you clear some space," he said, confusion in his voice. "She said you had talked about it for weeks, that you wanted to convert the attic into a guest room before the reunion. I started, but the realization was already dawning. Ethan, she lied. I never asked her to help clear anything. She sold my family's heirlooms without my permission." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "There must be some misunderstanding," he finally said. "Mom wouldn't do that." But she had done it, and I had the footage to prove it. That night, as Ethan tried to smooth things over on the phone with his mother, I made 3 important calls. The first was to Ashley, who promised to be on the next flight home from Chicago. The second was to Olivia Chen, my college roommate turned lawyer. And the third was to my Uncle David, the last living connection to Grandpa Henry besides me. "They did what?" Uncle David's gruff voice crackled through the phone. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 2 years, not since he moved to Alaska after a falling out with my father. But family is family, and some bonds run deeper than distance. "Sold everything, Uncle David. The watches, the tools, Grandpa's medals, the letters, all of it." His silence was heavy then. "I'm booking a flight. And Emma, check your email. Your grandfather sent something to you before he died. Said you'd know when it was time to open it. I think that time is now." The email was dated 3 years ago, just days before Grandpa Henry passed away. Subject line: "When the treasures aren't safe." I'd never seen it before. It had been filtered to spam and then archived. Inside was a single document, a detailed inventory of every item in his collection, complete with photographs, historical context, and approximate values. At the bottom, a note in his familiar handwriting. Emma, my little guardian, if you're reading this, someone has threatened our family's legacy. Remember what I taught you. Things can be replaced, but stories endure. There's more to our family history than what fits in boxes. When you need it most, look beneath the floorboard. Under my old reading chair, love always, Grandpa H. The reading chair now sat in our living room, a battered leather armchair that Barbara had tried numerous times to convince us to replace. With trembling hands, I pushed it aside and pried up the floorboard beneath. Inside the small cavity was a leather-bound journal and a USB drive labeled Wilson Legacy Complete. As dawn broke over Pine Ridge, I sat surrounded by Grandpa Henry's contingency plan, the final gift from a man who had apparently anticipated that someday someone might try to erase our family's past. The journal contained something far more valuable than a record of antiques. It held the stories, complete detailed accounts of each item's history, who had owned it, what it had witnessed. And the USB drive? A digital archive of everything, scanned documents, photographs, videos of Grandpa Henry himself talking about each piece, sharing the memories attached to them. The objects might be gone, but the legacy remained. And with the video evidence of Barbara's deception stored safely in my phone, I finally had what I needed to fight back. "You look terrible," Ashley announced when she arrived the next morning, dropping her suitcase in the hallway and pulling me into a fierce hug. "Have you slept at all?" I shook my head, leading her to the kitchen where I'd set up my laptop. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I've been going through Grandpa's files. Ash, you won't believe what he left for us. As I showed her the digital archive, Ashley's expression shifted from concern to amazement. He knew, didn't he? Somehow, he knew someone would try to take this from you. Not someone, I corrected, queuing up the security footage. Barbara. We watched together as my mother-in-law systematically dismantled my family's history, her commentary about worthless junk and outdated relics, particularly, stinging. "Where's Ethan now?" Ashley asked, her voice tight with anger. "At his parents' house, trying to understand both sides of the situation." The bitterness in my voice was unmistakable. "He thinks I'm overreacting, that it's just stuff that can be replaced." Ashley's expression hardened. "Then he doesn't understand what was taken. This wasn't just about things, Emma. This was about erasing your history, your connection to your past." She was right, of course. That's exactly what Barbara had done, or tried to do. But thanks to Grandpa Henry's foresight, she hadn't entirely succeeded. "So, what's the plan?" Ashley asked, pulling out her phone. "I've already texted Noah. He's checking flights. His cybersecurity expertise might come in handy." Noah, Ashley's husband, was a digital forensics specialist, exactly the kind of ally I needed right now. "First, we get everything back," I said with a determination that surprised even me. "Then we make sure Barbara faces consequences for what she's done." Ashley nodded, already typing. "I'm calling Uncle David. He'll want to be part of this." As my sister mobilized the Wilson family forces, I stared at the frozen image of Barbara on my screen, her smile smug as she handed over my family's treasures for a fraction of their worth. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," I whispered to the image, "but you're about to find out." What I didn't know then was just how deep this betrayal went, or how long Barbara Parker had been planning to remove all traces of the Wilson family from her son's life. Noah Parker arrived the next day, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by focused intensity after seeing the footage. "This is cut-and-dry theft," he stated, reviewing the videos again. "She had no authority to sell your property regardless of family connection." And Reed should have verified ownership before purchasing. Can we get everything back? I asked, the question that had been keeping me awake at night. Noah exchanged glances with Ashley before answering carefully. Legally, yes. Practically. It depends on whether Reed has already sold any pieces to other buyers. We need to move quickly then, Uncle David interjected. He'd arrived that morning, looking older than I remembered, but with the same determined set to his jaw that Grandpa Henry had. The longer those items are in circulation, the harder they'll be to recover. Olivia Chen joined our impromptu war council via video call, her legal expertise adding weight to our planning. I've drafted a demand letter to both Barbara and Reed's Antiques, she explained, her professional demeanor a stark contrast to the pajama-clad college girl I'd once shared a dorm with. We're citing specific statutes regarding theft and unauthorized sale of property. But Emma, you should know, this will likely escalate family tensions significantly. I glanced at the empty corner where Grandpa's reading chair had sat for years. They're already escalated, Liv. I just want my family's history back. The confrontation with Walter Reed came first. Noah and I walked into Reed's Antiques the following morning, my hands shaking slightly as I clutched a folder containing Grandpa's inventory and printouts of the security footage. Reed recognized me immediately, his expression shifting from shopkeeper's welcome to guarded caution. Mrs. Parker, how can I help you today? It's Wilson Parker, I corrected firmly. And I think you know why I'm here. To his credit, Reed didn't pretend ignorance for long. As soon as Noah introduced himself and mentioned digital evidence, the antique dealer's shoulders slumped. I suspected something wasn't right, he admitted, leading us to his cluttered office in the back of the store. Mrs. Parker, the elder Mrs. Parker, was very insistent that everything was above board, said she had power of attorney for family heirlooms. She lied, I said simply, sliding Olivia's letter across his desk. And you didn't verify her claims. Reed scanned the letter, his face paling slightly. I see. Well, fortunately, I haven't sold most of the items yet. The larger pieces are still in storage, and the watches are in my safe. Most? Noah picked up on the qualification immediately. Reed winced. The Civil War letters and some of the smaller tools were purchased by a collector from Burlington yesterday. But, he added quickly, seeing my expression, I have his contact information. I'm sure once the situation is explained. You'll explain it, Noah interrupted. Today, and you'll cover any costs involved in retrieving those items. Within an hour, we had recovered about 70% of my family's treasures, with Reed's assurance that he would personally handle retrieving the rest. The check Barbara had received was voided, and Reed issued a formal apology, clearly more concerned about potential legal repercussions than any loyalty to the Parkers. One small victory, but the larger battle loomed ahead. Have you heard from Ethan? Ashley asked, as we carefully transported the recovered items back to my house. I shook my head. Just a text saying he needs time to think, that he's trying to understand where the misunderstanding happened. Uncle David snorted from the driver's seat. Misunderstanding? That woman systematically removed your family history and sold it without permission. What's to understand? I had no answer. The distance growing between Ethan and me felt like its own kind of theft, something precious being quietly removed when I wasn't looking. Back at the house, we created a makeshift inventory area in the dining room, carefully checking each recovered item against Grandpa's detailed records. The empty spaces on our checklist represented items still missing, pieces of my history still out there, separated from their stories. The collector agreed to return the letters and tools, Noah announced, hanging up his phone. He's actually a history professor at Burlington College and was horrified to learn they were sold without permission. He's driving them over tomorrow. Another small victory, but I couldn't celebrate yet. Not with Barbara's betrayal still unaddressed and Ethan caught in the middle. The doorbell rang just as we were finishing dinner. Through the peephole, I saw Megan, Ethan's sister, shifting uncomfortably on the porch. "What is she doing here?" Ashley whispered, instantly defensive. "Let's find out," I replied, opening the door. Megan Parker had always been the most approachable member of Ethan's family, less concerned with appearances than her mother, though still firmly entrenched in the Parker way of doing things. Tonight she looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder, as if worried about being followed. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice unusually subdued. Privately, I led her to the kitchen, away from the curious eyes of my family. Megan declined my offer of coffee, instead pulling a small velvet pouch from her purse. "I thought you might want this back first," she said, sliding it across the counter. Inside was Grandpa Henry's pocket watch, his prized possession, the one he'd carried every day of his adult life until the day he died. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice catching as I cradled the familiar weight. Megan wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mom gave it to me. Said it was a family heirloom she was passing down. But when I heard what really happened, she finally looked up. Emma, there's something you should know. This isn't the first time." "What do you mean?" "Mom has issues with things that don't fit her narrative of our family. When Dad's mother died, there were family quilts, photographs, old furniture, pieces that had been in his family for generations. Within a year, everything was gone, replaced with new items that matched Mom's preferred aesthetic." I stared at her, pieces falling into place. "She erased his family's history, too." Megan nodded miserably. "Dad never stood up to her about it. I think he just found it easier to go along than to fight. But that's not all." She hesitated, then continued. "The renovation Mom's been planning for your attic? It wasn't just talk. She's already hired contractors. They're supposed to start next week, while you and Ethan are at the medical conference in Boston." The conference I'd nearly forgotten about in the chaos. 3 days away from home, during which Barbara apparently planned to completely transform our attic, removing any remaining traces of the Wilson family in the process. "How do you know this?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Because she asked me to supervise while you were gone. Said it was going to be a surprise for you." Megan made air quotes around the word. "Emma, I love my mother, but what she's doing isn't right. Ethan may not be able to see it yet, but I do." As Megan left, promising to share anything else she discovered about her mother's plans, I rejoined my family in the dining room, the pocket watch clutched in my hand like a talisman. "We need to move faster," I told them, explaining what Megan had revealed. "Barbara isn't just trying to get rid of a few old things. She's systematically erasing any Wilson influence from our lives." Uncle David's expression darkened. "This goes beyond disrespect. This is calculated." Noah nodded, already typing on his laptop. "We need to document everything. Create a timeline of Barbara's actions and intentions. If this escalates to legal action, having a clear pattern will strengthen our case." "And we need to talk to Ethan," Ashley added gently. "Really talk to him. He needs to understand what's happening before he gets pulled further into her manipulation." I knew she was right, but the prospect filled me with dread. Ethan had always been caught between two worlds, the Parker way of pristine appearances and social climbing, and the Wilson approach of valuing history, stories, and genuine connection. Until now, we'd managed to build our own path between these extremes. But Barbara's actions had forced a choice I never wanted him to have to make. Tomorrow, I decided. First, we secure what we've recovered and create a complete record. Then I'll talk to Ethan. As we worked into the night, cataloging each retrieved treasure and noting those still missing, I felt Grandpa Henry's presence more strongly than I had in years. The pocket watch ticked softly beside me on the table, its rhythm unchanged by time or circumstance. a small, constant reminder that while objects might be taken, the heart of what they represent endures. What I didn't know then was that Parker had one more devastating card to play, one that would force not just Ethan, but the entire Parker family to finally choose sides. The next morning brought unexpected news. Noah's phone buzzed during breakfast, and the conversation he had left him looking both concerned and oddly triumphant. "That was my contact at the Pine Ridge Historical Society," he explained after hanging up. Apparently, Barbara has been in talks with them about a significant donation, a collection of Parker family heirlooms for their upcoming exhibition on local founding families. "Parker heirlooms?" Uncle David repeated incredulously. "The Parkers have only been in Pine Ridge for one generation. Richard's family is from Connecticut, and Barbara grew up in Florida." "Exactly," Noah confirmed, which is why my contact was confused when Barbara presented items dating back to the Civil War. Items that seemed to match the description of your missing letters and medals. The realization hit me like a physical blow. She's not just getting rid of my family's history, she's rewriting it as her own. The audacity was breathtaking. Barbara wasn't content with simply removing Wilson family items from our home. She was actively appropriating them, creating a fictional Parker family legacy using my grandfather's carefully preserved treasures. "We need those donation documents," Olivia stated during our emergency video call. If she signed anything declaring those items as Parker family property, that's fraud. Noah was already ahead of her. "My contact is sending over copies this afternoon." Barbara left quite a paper trail. Apparently, she's been planning this donation for months. "Before she even took the items," Ashley noted, her voice tight with anger. "This was never impulsive. She's been systematically planning to erase Emma's family and replace it with a fabricated Parker history." As the pieces of Barbara's scheme became clearer, so did the urgent need to speak with Ethan. I couldn't put it off any longer. He agreed to meet me at the Lakeside Cafe, neutral territory, away from both our home and his parents' influence. When he arrived, the shadows under his eyes told me he'd been sleeping as poorly as I had. "Emma," he began awkwardly, sliding into the booth across from me. "I've been trying to sort through everything. Mom insists there was a misunderstanding, that she was only trying to help clear space for—" "Ethan," I interrupted gently, placing my phone on the table between us. "Before you continue, I need you to watch something." The security footage played silently on the small screen, Barbara and Walter Reed in our attic, her dismissive comments about worthless junk clearly visible in the captions Noah had added. Ethan's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, as he watched his mother deliberately misrepresent herself as authorized to sell my possessions. When the video ended, I placed Grandpa Henry's pocket watch on the table. "Your sister returned this to me. Your mother gave it to her, claiming it was a Parker family heirloom being passed down." Ethan picked up the watch, his fingers tracing the worn initials on the back, HJW, Henry James Wilson. My grandfather's watch, unmistakably a Wilson family treasure. "There's more," I continued softly, sliding across printed copies of the donation forms Barbara had submitted to the Historical Society. "She's been planning to donate my family's Civil War letters and medals to the Historical Society as Parker family heirlooms." Ethan's face paled as he read through the documents, particularly the portions where Barbara had fabricated elaborate stories about Parker ancestors in the Civil War. His great-grandfather had been an accountant in Hartford, Connecticut, nowhere near any battlefield. "This can't be right," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Mom wouldn't. She couldn't." "She did, Ethan. And she was planning to renovate our attic next week while we were at the conference, removing any remaining traces of my family's presence in our home." His head snapped up at that. "What? No, she mentioned wanting to help organize, but not—" Megan confirmed it. The contractors were already hired. Ethan sat back, looking shell-shocked. "Why? Why would she do this?" It was the question I'd— been asking myself for days. I think, I said carefully, your mother has always been uncomfortable with the Wilson influence in your life. Maybe she sees my family's history as competing with the narrative she's built for the Parkers. He was silent for a long moment, turning the pocket watch over and over in his hands. What happens now? He finally asked. That depends on you, Ethan. I've recovered most of the items, but some are still missing. And more importantly, your mother hasn't acknowledged what she did or apologized for it. You want me to confront her? It wasn't a question. I want you to stand with me, I corrected. This isn't about choosing between your mother and me. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. The truth was, it was absolutely about choice, just not the one I'd framed for him. Ethan needed to decide what kind of person he wanted to be. One who enabled harmful behavior for the sake of peace, or one who had the courage to acknowledge wrong, even when committed by those we love. We left the cafe with no resolution, but at least the facts were finally laid bare. Ethan promised to speak with his parents that evening, alone, and to call me afterward. That call never came. Instead, at 9:37 p.m., headlights swept across our living room as a car pulled into the driveway. Through the window, I watched Ethan emerge from his vehicle, followed by his father, Richard Parker. This was unexpected. Richard had maintained a careful distance from the conflict so far. Uncle David moved to stand beside me at the window. Want me to make myself scarce for this conversation? I shook my head. No more secrets, no more private conversations. Whatever needs to be said can be said in front of family. Richard Parker had always been something of an enigma to me, a successful businessman who'd built his wealth from nothing, yet who seemed perpetually overshadowed by his wife's social ambitions. Tonight, he looked tired, the usual perfect Parker, appearance slightly rumpled. "Emma," he greeted me with a nod as I opened the door. "David," he added, recognizing my uncle from family gatherings years ago. "I believe we have some matters to discuss." We settled in the living room, the recovered heirlooms still spread across every surface, a visual reminder of what had been at stake. Richard cleared his throat. "Ethan has shown me the evidence regarding Barbara's actions. I want to begin by offering my sincere apology for what has happened. It was more than I'd expected from him." Richard Parker was not a man known for admitting fault, his or anyone else's in his family. "I appreciate that," I said cautiously, "but I think the apology needs to come from Barbara." Richard and Ethan exchanged glances. "That's complicated," Richard admitted. "Barbara is not well, Emma." "What do you mean, not well?" Uncle David asked sharply. Richard sighed heavily. "For many years, Barbara has struggled with certain compulsions. The need to present a perfect image, to control how our family is perceived. Usually, it manifests in harmless ways, redecorating, obsessively embellishing stories, managing appearances. This went far beyond embellishing stories," I pointed out. "Yes," Richard acknowledged. "It's gotten worse recently. The Historical Society exhibition became a fixation for her. The Parker family wasn't eligible for inclusion. We haven't been here long enough, don't have the historical roots in Pine Ridge that would qualify us." He gestured to the items around us. "When she learned about your family's connection to local history, something shifted." Ethan picked up the thread. "Dad took Mom to see Dr. Levinson tonight. She's agreed to start treatment for her anxiety and compulsive behaviors." I tried to process this new information. While it helped explain Barbara's actions, it didn't excuse them. "I'm glad she's getting help," I said finally. "But that doesn't change what happened, or the fact that some items are still missing." "We know," Richard said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "That's partly why we're here. This is a certified check for the full appraised value of any items that can't be recovered. along with additional compensation for the distress caused. Uncle David regarded Richard skeptically. Money doesn't replace family history. No, it doesn't, Richard agreed. Which is why I've also brought this. He reached into a small case he'd carried in, removing a familiar leather-bound book, Grandpa Henry's recipe book. Barbara had hidden this in her personal safe. I believe it belongs here. As I took the book, its worn cover familiar under my fingers, Ethan spoke up. There's one more thing, Emma. Dad and I have been in contact with the Burlington collector. He's not only returning the letters and tools tomorrow, but he's offered his expertise to help digitally archive everything. Create a permanent record that can't be lost or taken. It was a thoughtful solution, addressing not just the physical return of items but the preservation of their stories and significance, the true heart of what had been threatened. Thank you, I said sincerely. Both of you. Richard looked, uncomfortable with gratitude. I should have paid more attention. Should have recognized what was happening before it went this far. The simple acknowledgement that he had failed to see, failed to act, was perhaps more meaningful than any check or returned item. It was accountability, the first step toward genuine amends. As our unexpected guests prepared to leave, Richard paused in the doorway. Barbara's treatment will take time. In the meantime, I've made arrangements to stay with my brother in Burlington. Ethan will be staying here if that's all right with you. We all think some distance might be beneficial right now. After they left, Ethan and I sat in silence, among the rescued remnants of my family's history. The road ahead would be complicated. Rebuilding trust, establishing boundaries, navigating family relationships forever altered by what had happened. I'm sorry, Ethan said finally. I should have seen it sooner. We both missed the signs, I admitted. But what matters is what we do now. What none of us realized then was that the recipe book Richard had returned contained something far more valuable than family recipes, something that would change our understanding of not just the Wilson family history, but the Parkers as well. The Burlington collector, Dr. Marcus Levine, arrived the next morning with the remaining missing items and a contagious enthusiasm for historical preservation. Within hours, our dining room had been transformed into a makeshift archiving station, with Noah and Dr. Levine discussing digital storage options, while Ashley and I carefully organized the physical items. This letter is remarkable, Dr. Levine commented, gently handling one of the Civil War documents. Your ancestors' perspective on the Battle of Gettysburg. It adds a dimension missing from many official accounts. My grandfather used to read these to me, I remembered, the bittersweet memory washing over me. He said history books tell you what happened, but letters tell you how it felt. A wise man, Dr. Levine nodded appreciatively. These deserve to be shared, you know. Not taken away or hidden, but properly preserved and made accessible to those who would value them. His words struck a chord. While recovering the items had been my immediate concern, I hadn't given much thought to their future. Keeping them, locked away in my attic, wasn't so different from having them sold off. In both cases, their stories remained untold, their value unshared. Perhaps, I said slowly, once everything is documented, we might consider a proper exhibition. Through the Historical Society, but with the Wilson family history intact and acknowledged. Dr. Levine beamed. A wonderful idea. I'd be happy to assist with the curation. As our impromptu archiving team worked through the collection, I found myself drawn to Grandpa Henry's recipe book. It had always been more than a cookbook. It was a family record, with notes scribbled in margins and photographs pressed between pages. Opening it now, with all that had happened, I noticed details I'd overlooked before. In the back section, where the binding had loosened slightly with age, several pages seemed different from the rest, thicker paper, older handwriting. Carefully separating them, I found myself looking at what appeared to be journal entries dating back to the 1890s. Uncle David, I called, my voice betraying my excitement. "I think I found something." The journal entries were written by my great-great-grandmother, Caroline Wilson, detailing her life in early Pine Ridge. But one passage in particular caught my attention. April 18th, 1897. Richard came again today, bringing honey from his family's farm. His kindness is a balm during these difficult times. Though Father disapproves of his visits, I find myself looking forward to them more than I should admit. The Parkers may not have the status of other families in Pine Ridge, but there is an honesty in Richard's manner that I find preferable to the practiced charm of more suitable suitors. I read the passage aloud, my voice faltering on the final words. "Parkers? In Pine Ridge in the 1890s? Uncle David leaned over my shoulder, his expression shifting from curiosity to astonishment. "That's impossible. Richard's family came here in the 1970s. They're newcomers." "Apparently not," I murmured, carefully turning to the next entry. May 30, 1897. Another argument with Father about the Parkers. He insists they are beneath our station, that their small honey farm cannot possibly provide a suitable living. I reminded him that the Wilsons were hardly aristocracy when they first settled here. Grandfather's pocket watch, the one Father prizes so highly, was earned through labor, not inherited privilege. Father did not appreciate the comparison. "Emma." Ethan's voice startled me. He'd been so quiet, observing our work from the periphery, that I'd almost forgotten he was there. "May I see that?" I handed him the book, watching as he read the entries, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "My father's middle name is Richard, named after his grandfather, and my great-grandfather kept bees before moving to Connecticut. It's a family story Dad used to tell. How the Parkers were once known for their honey. Are you saying—" I began. "I'm saying we need to show this to my father," Ethan replied. "Now." Richard Parker arrived within the hour, his usual composed demeanor cracking slightly at Ethan's cryptic phone call. When presented with Caroline Wilson's journal entries, he sat heavily in Grandpa Henry's reading chair, the pages trembling slightly in his hands. "I never knew," he said finally, his voice unusually subdued. "The family history, I was told, began in Connecticut. Before that was unclear. There were rumors of relatives further north, but nothing specific. Nothing about Pine Ridge." Dr. Levine, who had been listening with scholarly interest, cleared his throat. "If I may, this suggests the Wilson and Parker families might share a connection that predates your marriage." He gestured between Ethan and me. "A connection that was lost to time, or perhaps deliberately obscured." "But why would anyone hide it?" Ashley asked, voicing the question on all our minds. Richard shook his head, still processing the revelation. "Family disputes can span generations. Names change, people move, stories get altered in the telling. My grandfather rarely spoke of his youth. I always assumed it was because there was nothing noteworthy to tell. I thought of Barbara, her desperate need to fabricate a distinguished Parker family history, completely unaware that genuine connections to Pine Ridge's past might have existed all along. "There's one way to confirm this," Noah suggested, his practical nature asserting itself. "The Historical Society maintains genealogical records dating back to the town's founding. If there were Parkers in Pine Ridge in the 1890s, there would be documentation." "I can help with that research," Dr. Levine offered eagerly. "With your permission, of course." Richard nodded, still dazed by the possibility that his family's roots in Pine Ridge might be far deeper than he'd ever known. As plans were made for a deep dive into local archives, I found myself watching Richard, seeing him with new eyes. The man who had always seemed like the embodiment of nouveau riche ambition might actually have deeper connections to this town than anyone realized. It was a humbling reminder that family histories are rarely as straightforward as we believe them to be. That evening, as our unexpected allies departed with research plans in place, Ethan and I finally had a moment alone. The house felt different, somehow still filled with the physical remnants of my family's past, but now vibrating with new possibilities, new connections waiting to be discovered. "I should call my mother," Ethan said quietly, fidgeting with Grandpa Henry's pocket watch. "Tell her what we found." The mention of Barbara brought a wave of complicated emotions. While I was still angry about what she'd done, the revelation that our families might share a historical connection added a layer of complexity to the situation. "Do you think it would help?" I asked, genuinely uncertain. If her issues stem from feeling like the Parkers don't have the historical standing she wants, then learning they might have been here all along could either soothe that insecurity or make it worse, Ethan finished, understanding my concern. "I don't know, Emma. But I do know that keeping secrets hasn't served either of our families well." He was right, of course. Whatever happened next, it needed to be built on honesty, the full truth, not convenient versions of it. "Make the call," I decided. "But speakerphone, please. I think we both need to hear her reaction." Barbara answered on the third ring, her voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Ethan? Is everything all right? Mom, you're on speaker. Emma's here too. We've found something you should know about." As Ethan explained about Caroline Wilson's journal and the potential Parker connection to early Pine Ridge, I watched his face carefully, the blend of hope and apprehension as he tried to build a bridge between the people he loved most. Barbara was silent for so long after Ethan finished that I thought the call might have dropped. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you certain? The Parkers were actually in Pine Ridge back then?" "We're researching it now," Ethan confirmed. "But the journal entries are quite specific. They mention a Richard Parker who owned a honey farm." Another long pause. "My Richard never told me. He never knew." What struck me most was what Barbara didn't say. No defensive posturing, no dismissal of the Wilson family records, no attempt to claim this discovery as validation of her actions, just quiet wonder at the possibility. Dr. Levine, the historian who's helping us, suggested that once we've confirmed the connection, both families could be featured in the Historical Society exhibition, I offered, extending an olive branch I wasn't entirely sure I was ready to give. The Wilson and Parker families, their shared history in Pine Ridge. "You would do that?" Barbara asked, genuine surprise in her voice. "After what I did?" "What you did was wrong," I stated clearly, unwilling to sugarcoat the truth. "But punishing you won't bring back what was lost. And if our families really do share a history, then perhaps we can find a way forward that honors both legacies." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was an acknowledgement that family relationships are complicated, messy things, worthy of effort, even when damaged. "Thank you, Emma," Barbara said quietly. I don't deserve your kindness." "It's not about deserving," I replied. "It's about choosing what kind of family we want to be moving forward." After the call ended, Ethan pulled me into a tight embrace. "Thank you," he whispered against my hair, "for being willing to try." I didn't tell him how tentative my willingness was, how much work Barbara would need to do to earn back any measure of trust. That conversation could wait for another day. For now, it was enough that we had found a potential path forward, one that neither erased the past nor remained trapped in it. The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Dr. Levine arrived with documents from the Historical Society archives, census records, property deeds, church registries, all confirming what Caroline Wilson's journal had suggested. The Parkers had indeed owned a small honey farm on what was now the outskirts of Pine Ridge, just a mile from where the Wilson family had established their first home in the area. "There's more," Dr. Levine announced, spreading out a faded photograph. This was in the church archives, labeled Harvest Festival, 1899. In the sepia-toned image, rows of townspeople stood before a church, and there, side by side, were faces, that bore striking resemblances to family photographs I'd seen all my life. Caroline Wilson, her expression serious, but eyes bright, standing next to a tall man with the same jawline Ethan had inherited. Richard Parker and Caroline Wilson, Dr. Levine confirmed. According to parish records, they married in 1901, despite apparent family objections. Uncle David, who had been examining the documents with scholarly focus, looked up sharply. Married? But that's not possible. Caroline Wilson married Edward Thompson in 1902. It's documented in our family Bible. Dr. Levine's eyes lit with the excitement of historical mystery. Actually, she married Richard Parker in January 1901. Edward Thompson appears on the scene in late 1902 after Richard's death in a farming accident. The remarriage was quick, within months. The implications settled over us like dust, disturbed after decades of stillness. If Caroline Wilson had first married Richard Parker before his untimely death, then... Our families didn't just know each other, Ethan said slowly. They were actually one family, at least briefly. More than briefly, Dr. Levine corrected, gently, sliding another document forward. The parish birth records show Caroline gave birth to a son in October 1901. Joseph Parker. My grandfather was born in 1903, Uncle David objected. William Wilson, son of Caroline and Edward. Dr. Levine nodded. Yes, her son from her second marriage. But her first son, Joseph Parker, would have been Richard Parker's father, if I'm following the genealogy correctly. Richard Parker, who had arrived partway through this revelation, sank into a chair. My father never mentioned any of this. He was raised in Connecticut, or so I always believed. Connecticut records confirm Joseph Parker moved there as a young man, Dr. Levine explained. After his mother's remarriage, he appears to have been raised by his paternal grandparents, then struck out on his own as soon as he was old enough. The Parker honey farm was sold after Richard's death. So the Parkers and Wilsons, I began, are distant cousins of a sort, Dr. Levine finished. Caroline Wilson Parker Thompson connects your family lines. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of history rewritten. Everything we thought we knew about our separate family histories had been upended by this revelation of shared roots, loss, and perhaps even deliberate forgetting. Does Barbara know? I asked Richard quietly. He shook his head. I called her. Last night after speaking with you, told her about the possibility. But this confirmation. She should hear it in person, Ethan decided. From both of us, he added, looking at me questioningly. It was a lot to ask, that I face the woman who had tried to erase my family's history, now armed with the knowledge that our families were actually intertwined. But the symmetry wasn't lost on me. Barbara had sought to separate what history had already joined together long before any of us were born. We'll go together, I agreed, surprising even myself with the steadiness in my voice. Barbara Parker was staying at a small extended-stay hotel near her treatment center. The room was immaculately kept, but lacked the ostentatious touches I'd come to associate with her taste. She looked smaller somehow, her perfect appearance slightly muted, though she'd clearly made an effort for our visit. Ethan said you found something definitive, she said after awkward greetings were exchanged. About the Parkers in Pine Ridge. Together, Ethan and I explained what Dr. Levine had discovered. The marriage of Caroline Wilson and Richard Parker, the birth of Joseph, the tragedy that separated the families, and the subsequent remarriages that obscured their connection. Barbara listened without interruption, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When we finished, she remained silent for a long moment. All this time, she finally said, I was trying to invent a history for the Parkers that would rival the Wilsons, and it turns out we shared a history all along. It appears so, I agreed cautiously. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly for perhaps the first time since this ordeal began. The irony isn't lost on me, Emma. I tried to erase your family's presence, when in fact the Parkers wouldn't exist in Pine Ridge without the Wilsons. It wasn't quite an apology, but there was a humility in her words that I'd never heard before. "What happens now?" she asked, the question directed at both of us, but her eyes still on me. "That depends," I said honestly, "on whether you're willing to acknowledge what you did, make genuine amends, and respect boundaries moving forward. And if I am? Then perhaps we start by correctly telling both our families' stories, together." I reached into my bag, removing a folder of documents Dr. Levine had prepared. The Historical Society is still interested in featuring local family histories. Both the Wilsons and the Parkers qualify. The real stories, not fabricated ones. Barbara carefully opened the folder, her fingers trailing over the copies of century-old documents. "I would like that," she said quietly. "To be part of a real history, not one I had to invent." It was a small step, but a significant one. The road to rebuilding trust would be long, with likely setbacks and difficulties along the way. But, for the first time, I could see a potential path, not back to what was before, but forward to something new. As we left the hotel, Ethan squeezed my hand. "Thank you." "For what?" "For being willing to see her, for offering a way forward, even though you had every right to shut that door completely." I thought about Grandpa Henry, about the stories he'd told me of resilience and forgiveness, about valuing truth over convenience. "Family is complicated," I said finally, "and it turns out ours is more complicated than either of us knew." The Historical Society exhibition opened 3 months later, featuring a joint display titled Wilson Parker, Divided Branches of a Shared Tree. Barbara, still in treatment but making steady progress, attended with Richard, standing awkwardly but determinedly beside Uncle David as Dr. Levine guided visitors through the newly discovered family history. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a replicated family tree, showing how the briefly united Wilson Parker line had split after tragedy, only to be reunited generations later when Ethan and I married, a circular journey none of us could have imagined. Grandpa Henry's pocket watches, Civil War letters, and woodworking tools were displayed alongside newly discovered Parker family items that Richard had located in Connecticut after learning of his Pine Ridge ancestry. Honey jars with faded labels, a beekeeper's journal, photographs of the original Parker farm. "What do you think Grandpa Henry would make of all this?" Ashley asked, standing beside me as we watched visitors engage with our family's story. I fingered the pocket watch I now wore daily, returned to the Wilson family but carrying a history more complex than I'd ever known. "I think he knew more than he let on," I admitted. "Some of his stories about Caroline make more sense now, knowing about her first marriage and loss." "You think he deliberately kept the Parker connection quiet?" I shook my head. "Not deliberately hidden, perhaps, but selectively remembered. Family stories tend to emphasize some chapters while minimizing others. The Thompson marriage lasted decades, the Parker one less than a year. Over time, the shorter connection faded from the narrative. Until Barbara accidentally forced it back into the light," Ashley observed wryly. "In trying to erase one history, she uncovered another," I agreed. Not the outcome she expected when she walked into our attic that day. Across the room, I caught Ethan's eye. He was standing with his father and sister, explaining something about the honey farm display to an elderly visitor. The past months had been challenging for all of us, establishing new boundaries, navigating changed relationships, integrating unexpected histories into our understanding of ourselves. But watching him now, seeing the easy way he moved between his family and mine, I felt something settle within me. We were writing a new chapter in a story that had begun long before any of us were born. A story of separation and reunion, of forgetting and remembering, of the complex ways families break apart and come together again. The security cameras in my attic had captured Barbara's betrayal, but they'd also set in motion a discovery that none of us could have anticipated. Sometimes, it seems, the past has its own way of making itself known, regardless of our efforts to rewrite or erase it. That evening, after the exhibition opening, our extended family gathered at the Wilson family cabin. The first time both families had been together since the truth had emerged. Barbara, granted a day pass from her treatment program, sat somewhat apart, her usual commanding presence subdued but not entirely gone. During a lull in conversation, she approached me, holding something carefully wrapped in tissue paper. "I found this in an antique shop in Burlington last week," she said, offering the small package. The owner had just acquired it and recognized the connection to the exhibition preparations. Unwrapping the tissue revealed a small silver honey dipper engraved with the initials RP and the date 1899. "Richard Parker's," I breathed, recognizing the craftsmanship similar to other items we'd discovered. Barbara nodded. "I thought it should be with the collection, where it belongs." The gesture, her purchasing a genuine Parker family item rather than trying to claim Wilson heirlooms as her own, wasn't lost on me. It was a small step, but a meaningful one. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "It's a perfect addition." As I placed the honey dipper among the other displayed items, I noticed something I hadn't before: how the silver gleam matched the casing of Grandpa Henry's pocket watch, how the engravings shared similar flourishes despite being created for different families. Different branches, same tree, just as Dr. Levine's exhibition had described. Later, as darkness fell and lanterns were lit around the cabin's porch, Ethan found me sitting alone, watching the intermingled families inside through the window. Richard deep in conversation with Uncle David, Ashley showing Megan old photographs, even Barbara making cautious efforts to engage rather than dominate. "Penny for your thoughts?" Ethan asked, sitting beside me. "I was just thinking about those cameras in the attic," I admitted. "How something I installed out of suspicion ended up leading to all of this." I gestured toward the gathering inside. "Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding," Ethan supplied. "A more complete picture." "Yes," I agreed. The cameras caught Barbara taking items that didn't belong to her. But they also started a chain of events that recovered something even more valuable, a lost chapter of both our families' stories. Ethan took my hand, his grandfather's watch chain just visible in his pocket. Richard had returned it to him earlier that day, suggesting the Parker-Wilson connection meant it had always been where it belonged. "I never expected family history to be so complicated," he said with a small smile. "Or that yours and mine would turn out to be partially shared," I added. Above us, stars emerged in the clear night sky, constant witnesses to generations of human stories, separations and reunions, losses and discoveries. I thought about Caroline Wilson Parker Thompson, whose brief first marriage had been nearly erased from family memory, yet whose choices continued to ripple through our lives more than a century later. "We should probably get back inside," Ethan suggested after a comfortable silence, "before they send a search party." As we rose to rejoin our complicated, imperfect, unexpectedly interconnected families, I cast one last glance at the night sky. The past couldn't be changed, but it could be more fully understood. The future couldn't be predicted, but it could be approached with hard-earned wisdom. And the present, this moment of tentative new beginnings, was ours to shape with both honesty about what had happened and hope for what might yet be. Sometimes, it seems, the truest legacy isn't found in objects that can be stolen or sold, but in stories that endure, connections that persist, and truths that eventually come to light, even when hidden cameras are required to begin the process of their discovery. Dr. Levine had promised to help digitize our entire family collection, creating an archive that could never be lost or taken. But as I watched Barbara carefully place the silver honey dipper in the display case, her hands no longer grasping but offering, I realized something important. The most valuable preservation wasn't happening in databases or climate-controlled exhibits. but in this room, among people choosing to acknowledge complicated truths rather than convenient fictions. That, perhaps, was the true legacy worth protecting, not just objects from the past, but honesty in the present and the possibility of genuine connection moving forward. A legacy measured not in silver or gold or even historical significance, but in the courage to see clearly, speak truthfully, and remain open to discovering that family histories are rarely as simple as we believe them to be. As we stepped back inside to rejoin the gathering, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window glass. Grandpa Henry's watch chain now visible against my sweater, a physical link to a past more complex and interconnected than any of us had imagined. Not an ending to our family saga, but a new chapter, written with the hard-earned wisdom that sometimes the most valuable discoveries come from the most painful betrayals. And sometimes, hidden cameras reveal far more than anyone anticipated. The following spring, the Wilson Parker family history became part of the permanent collection at the Pine Ridge Historical Society, telling a story not just of two families, but of how history gets written, forgotten, and rediscovered. How? The stories we tell ourselves shape our understanding of who we are and where we belong. Barbara completed her treatment program and moved into a small apartment on her own, her first time living independently in decades. The distance from Richard continued, though they occasionally appeared together at family gatherings, their relationship evolving into something different but not entirely severed. The attic in our home remained a space for family treasures, but with an important difference. Items from both the Wilson and Parker histories now shared the carefully preserved space, each with detailed documentation of its provenance and significance. And while the security cameras remained, they served a different purpose now. Not catching thieves, but recording as Ethan and I documented each item for future generations, ensuring that no part of our complicated family history would be forgotten again. When visitors asked about the unusual collection, Wilson woodworking tools displayed alongside Parker beekeeping equipment, Civil War letters beside Connecticut business ledgers, we would simply explain, it's all family history. Different branches, same tree. And in that simple explanation lay the hard-won wisdom of our experience, that family legacies are rarely straightforward, that healing comes not from erasure, but from honest reckoning with the past, and that sometimes the most unexpected discoveries wait just beneath the surface of the stories we think we know by heart. The cameras in my attic had captured a betrayal, but they had also set in motion a revelation, one that reminded all of us that the past is never truly gone, merely waiting to be rediscovered when we're finally ready to see it clearly. 1 year after the exhibition opened, I found myself once again sorting through family treasures in our attic. This time, however, the purpose was different. We weren't cataloging items out of fear they might disappear, but preparing to share them with a wider audience. The Pine Ridge Historical Society had requested a traveling exhibition, Family Histories Recovered, that would visit 3 neighboring towns before returning home. "What do you think about including the Honey Dipper?" Ethan asked, carefully wrapping a set of woodworking tools in acid-free tissue paper. I considered the silver piece, now one of my favorite items in our collection despite its complicated history, or perhaps because of it. Definitely. It represents everything this exhibition is about. Lost connections rediscovered. The doorbell interrupted our work. From the attic window, I could see Barbara's car in the driveway. Though our relationship had improved significantly, over the past year, these visits still carried a certain tension. The memory of betrayal faded, but not entirely gone. "I'll get it," Ethan offered, sensing my hesitation. I continued wrapping items, listening to their muffled greetings below. When footsteps on the stairs announced their approach, I took a steadying breath. Barbara appeared in the doorway, looking more like herself than she had in months, her hair perfectly styled, her outfit coordinated with characteristic precision. Yet something was different, a softness around her eyes, perhaps, or a less rigid set to her shoulders. "Emma," she greeted me with a tentative smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "I hope I'm not interrupting," "We're just preparing for the traveling exhibition," I explained, gesturing to the organized chaos around us. "The Historical Society needs everything ready by Friday." Barbara nodded, her gaze taking in the transformed attic. Where once family heirlooms had been haphazardly stored, now custom shelving housed carefully labeled items, a climate control system hummed quietly, and a small desk held a computer dedicated to our ongoing digitization efforts. "It looks professional," she observed, "like a proper archive." "That was the goal," I acknowledged. "Dr. Levine has been an incredible resource." An awkward silence followed, broken when Barbara reached into her purse and withdrew a small jewelry. "I wanted to give you this before the exhibition leaves town," she said, extending the box toward me. "I found it in Connecticut last month while helping Richard clear out his mother's house." Inside was a delicate gold locket, tarnished with age. When opened, it revealed a tiny photograph of a young woman with serious eyes that somehow seemed familiar. "Caroline Wilson Parker," Barbara explained, watching my reaction carefully. "Richard's grandfather kept it all his life, though he never spoke of her to the family. We found it in a hidden compartment of his desk." I cradled the locket, stunned by its significance. "This would have belonged to Joseph, their son." Barbara nodded. "He must have taken it when he left Pine Ridge, a memory of the mother who stayed behind when he went to live with his grandparents." The weight of generations pressed into my palm, the tangible evidence of a family separation that had lasted nearly a century, only to be bridged unexpectedly in our lifetime. "Thank you," I said simply, the words inadequate for the gesture. This wasn't like the Honey Dipper, a purchased antiquity meant as a peace offering. This was a genuine Parker family treasure being willingly shared with the Wilsons. "I thought it should be part of the exhibition," Barbara said, her voice steadier now. "The complete story deserves to be told." As she helped us continue packing items for the exhibition, I was struck by how much had changed. The woman who had once attempted to erase Wilson family history was now actively helping preserve it and integrate it with her own family's past. Her transformation wasn't miraculous or complete. Therapy and medication had helped address her compulsions, but the real change had come through confronting the truth about herself and her motivations. "I spoke with Megan this morning," Barbara mentioned as we carefully labeled a box of documents. "She and Greg are considering moving back to Pine Ridge after the baby comes." Megan's pregnancy, the first grandchild for both our families, had been a source of unexpected joy, bringing us together despite lingering tensions. "We'd love to have them closer," I agreed. "Ashley's been collecting baby furniture like she's expecting triplets instead of a niece." "I've been thinking about looking for a place here again too," Barbara admitted, focusing intently on the label she was writing. "The apartment in Burlington is fine, but—" She didn't need to finish. The thought. Burlington was where she'd gone for treatment, where she'd rebuilt her life after the separation from Richard. But it wasn't home. Despite everything, Pine Ridge was where both our families had roots, tangled, complicated roots that went deeper than any of us had realized. "There's a nice cottage for sale on Maple Street," I found myself saying. "Walking distance to the Historical Society, where you've been volunteering." The surprise in her eyes told me she hadn't expected this overture, this acknowledgement that her presence in town wasn't unwelcome, at least not by me. "I'll look into it," she said carefully, then added, "Richard mentioned he might sell the house. It's too big for just him, and it held too many memories of their life before, the carefully constructed image they'd maintained, the pressure to appear perfect that had contributed to Barbara's spiral." "Fresh starts can be good," I offered, thinking of how our own lives had transformed over the past year. The traveling exhibition opened the following week to unexpected interest from neighboring communities. Ethan and I attended the opening reception, where Dr. Levine proudly guided visitors through the displays. The centerpiece was now a timeline showing how the Wilson and Parker families had intersected, separated, and ultimately reconnected, a visual representation of the complicated path that had led us all here. "You should be proud," a voice said, beside me. I turned to find Walter Reed, the antique dealer who had unwittingly participated in Barbara's scheme. Since making amends by helping recover the sold items, he'd become an unexpected ally in our preservation efforts. "It's been a community project," I demurred. Reed shook his head. "Not many people would turn a betrayal into something this positive. Most would have pressed charges and walked away." His words made me reflect on the journey of the past year, from the shock of discovering empty shelves in my attic to standing in a museum exhibition that now included both Wilson and Parker family histories. The path hadn't been easy or straightforward. There had been difficult conversations, setbacks, moments when forgiveness seemed impossible. But gradually, painfully, something new had emerged from the ashes of what was destroyed. "Sometimes, losing something shows you what's truly valuable," I said finally. The following Sunday, our extended family gathered at the Wilson cabin for what had become a monthly tradition. Uncle David manned the grill while Ashley arranged place settings on the long outdoor table. Noah and Richard were deep in conversation about the historical documents they'd discovered in Connecticut, spreading papers across the picnic table as they traced family connections. Barbara arrived last, looking uncharacteristically nervous as she approached with a large bag. "I found these yesterday," she explained, placing the bag on the table. "In storage in Hartford. Inside were photo albums, dozens of them dating back to the 1940s. Parker family photographs that none of us had seen before, carefully preserved despite being hidden away for decades. My mother-in-law was apparently quite the photographer," Barbara explained as we gathered around. "She documented everything, but Richard's father didn't want the albums in the house after she died. Too painful, I suppose." The photographs revealed a Parker family history far richer than Barbara had ever acknowledged. Not the prestigious social connections she'd longed for, but genuine moments of family life. Richard as a child, playing in the backyard of a modest home. His father, Joseph Parker III, working on a car engine. Holiday gatherings, school events, everyday scenes from a life that had been minimized in favor of a more polished narrative. "I never knew these existed," Richard said quietly, turning pages with careful fingers. "Dad never talked about his childhood." "People often don't share what they think doesn't measure up," Barbara observed, a new wisdom in her voice. "I spent years trying to create the perfect family image, never realizing that these ordinary moments are what actually matter." As the afternoon progressed, the photo albums circulated among family members, creating a bridge between past and present. Megan exclaimed over how much Ethan resembled his grandfather, while Ashley pointed out expressions and mannerisms that had clearly been passed down through generations. "Look at this," Uncle David said suddenly, holding up a photograph from the 1950s. "Does that backdrop look familiar to anyone?" The image showed Richard's parents standing before a rural landscape, a distinctive hill formation visible in the distance. "That's Lookout Point," I realized, naming a local landmark visible from our cabin. "They must have visited Pine Ridge." Richard stared at the photo in disbelief. "Dad always said he'd never been here before we moved in 1978. "Perhaps it was too painful," Barbara suggested, her insight born of her own therapy. "If he knew about the family connection, but it was associated with loss." The discovery prompted a new wave of conversation, theories about what Joseph Parker might have known about his Pine Ridge ancestry, why he'd chosen to return to the area after generations away, whether coincidence or subconscious memory had drawn the Parkers back to their original hometown. As twilight fell and lanterns were lit around the cabin, I found myself sitting beside Barbara on the porch steps, slightly removed from the animated discussions still taking place inside. "Thank you," she said after a comfortable silence. For including the Parker history in the exhibition, for making space for our story alongside yours. They're not separate stories anymore, I pointed out. They never really were. She nodded, understanding the deeper significance. I spent so many years feeling like an outsider in this town, like the Parkers were newcomers who needed to prove they belonged. If I'd only known that your family had roots here all along. That belonging isn't something you have to fabricate or steal, she corrected. It's something you build through genuine connections and shared history. It was perhaps the most honest reflection I'd ever heard from her, an acknowledgement of the insecurity that had driven her actions and the wisdom she'd gained through facing their consequences. Inside, someone had found an old photo album of the Wilsons, and excited voices called us to come see newly discovered parallels between our families. As we rose to join them, Barbara hesitated. I know I can never fully make up for what I did, she said quietly. But I want you to know I'm truly sorry, not just for taking the items, but for trying to erase your family's presence. I was wrong, and I'm working every day to be better. It was the direct apology she'd never quite managed before. Simple, unqualified, without excuses. I know you are, I acknowledged. And that's why we're here, on this porch, having this conversation. The path to forgiveness wasn't complete, might never be entirely finished, but it was being walked, step by careful step, by all of us. 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Levine. Emma, you need to come to the Historical Society right away, he said, excitement vibrating in his voice. Bring Ethan and Richard if you can. There's something you all need to see. When we arrived, Dr. Levine led us to the research room where an elderly man waited, surrounded by archival boxes. This is Mr. Jenkins from the State Historical Archives, Dr. Levine introduced us. He's been helping digitize their collection of regional newspapers, and he found something I think you'll find significant. Mr. Jenkins nodded in greeting, then carefully removed a protective folder from one of the boxes. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping dated July 1900. It's the announcement of Caroline Wilson's marriage to Richard Parker, Dr. Levine explained as we gathered around. But notice the last paragraph. I leaned closer to read the faded text. The bride wore her grandmother's lace veil and carried wildflowers gathered from the meadow where the couple first met. In a departure from tradition, Miss Wilson wore a gold locket containing a likeness of her late mother, a piece crafted by the groom himself as a betrothal gift. The locket, I whispered, thinking of the tarnished piece Barbara had discovered in Connecticut. Richard Parker made it. Mr. Jenkins nodded, pleased by our reaction. Gold and silversmithing was often a supplementary trade for farmers in that era. The article mentions that Parker was known locally for his metalwork, particularly bee-themed jewelry inspired by his family's honey farm. Richard looked stunned. My grandfather was a hobbyist jeweler. I never knew where that interest came from. It seemed out of place for a businessman from Connecticut. Family traits have a way of persisting, Mr. Jenkins observed, even when the stories behind them are forgotten. He carefully removed another document from his files, a business ledger from 1898 to 1900. This belonged to a general store in Pine Ridge. I found several entries for R. Parker, purchasing silver and gold components, along with the tools of the trade. As we pored over these new discoveries, I couldn't help but think about how our understanding of both families continued to evolve. The locket that had seemed merely a sentimental connection to Caroline was now revealed as something far more significant. Physical evidence of Richard Parker's craft, a skill that had apparently been passed down through generations without the context of its origin. There's something else, Mr. Jenkins added, opening another folder. The Parker honey farm didn't simply disappear after Richard's death. According to property records, it was purchased by Edward Thompson, Caroline's second husband, and incorporated into the Thompson farm. The beehives remained in production for another 20 years. This revelation felt particularly meaningful, the idea that even after tragedy separated our families, something of the Parkers' legacy had been preserved by the very man who had in many ways replaced Richard in Caroline's life. Edward Thompson didn't erase Richard Parker's existence, I realized aloud. He helped maintain part of it. Dr. Levine nodded. History is rarely as clear-cut as we imagine. Relationships, especially in small communities, were complex webs of connection that can't be reduced to simple narratives. As we left the Historical Society that afternoon, I found myself thinking about Barbara, how her attempts to fabricate a distinguished Parker history had inadvertently led us to discover the genuine article. There was a poetic justice in it, but also a profound lesson about the futility of trying to control how history remembers us. That evening, I called Barbara to share our discoveries. Her genuine excitement at learning about Richard Parker's metalworking confirmed how far she'd come from the woman who had once seen Wilson family history as competition, rather than complementary to her own. "I've been thinking," she said toward the end of our conversation, "the cottage on Maple Street, I made an offer yesterday." "That's wonderful," I replied, genuinely pleased. "It's a beautiful home." "I want to be closer," she explained. New vulnerability in her voice. "For Megan and the baby, of course, but also to be part of this continuing discovery. Our family's shared history is still unfolding, and I don't want to miss any more of it." The sentiment touched me deeply. This acknowledgement that our connected past was not just something to be preserved in museums, but a living, evolving story that continued to shape our present. "We're having a research day at the cabin this weekend," I found myself offering. "Dr. Levine is bringing some documents he found in church archives. You'd be welcome to join us." Her silence told me she understood the significance of the invitation, not just to a family gathering, but to be an active participant in our shared journey of discovery. "I'd like that very much," she said finally. As summer turned to fall, the traveling exhibition returned to Pine Ridge, enriched by the discoveries made during its journey. The Historical Society planned a special event to mark its homecoming, a community gathering where local families were invited to bring their own historical items for documentation and possible inclusion in future exhibitions. I volunteered at the identification table, helping people understand the significance of family treasures they'd brought. Uncle David manned the scanning station, creating digital records of photographs and documents, while Noah provided technical expertise on preserving delicate items. Barbara had taken charge of the refreshment area, her organizational skills put to positive use as she coordinated volunteers and ensured everything ran smoothly. Watching her direct high school students with kind efficiency, I marveled at the transformation. The need for control that had once manifested as manipulation now found constructive outlets in her volunteer work. "Mrs. Wilson Parker?" A tentative voice drew my attention back to the identification table. An elderly woman stood before me, clutching a wooden box. "I read about your family in the exhibition catalog. I think I might have something that belongs with your collection." She carefully opened the box to reveal a tarnished silver honey dipper, nearly identical to the one Barbara had found in Burlington. "My grandfather purchased this at an estate sale in Hartford in the 1940s, she explained. "It's been in our family ever since, but after seeing your exhibition, well, look at the engraving." On the handle, barely visible beneath decades of tarnish, were the initials RP with a tiny bee design, the maker's mark we now recognized as Richard Parker's. "The catalog mentioned he made pairs of things," the woman continued. "Wedding gifts and such. When I saw the honey dipper in your display and read about the Parker Honey Farm, I wondered if this might be the match to it. I carefully examined the piece, noting the identical craftsmanship to our own dipper. I believe you're right. This would have been part of a serving set, One for honey, one for cream. The woman nodded, satisfied. Then it should go back, where it belongs, with your family collection. As I began to protest that we couldn't accept such a valuable gift, she held up her hand. My family has enjoyed it for 3 generations without knowing its true significance. Now that we know, it seems right for it to rejoin its pair. History should be whole when possible, don't you think? Her generosity left me speechless. After thanking her properly and documenting the donation, I sought out Barbara, who was arranging cookies on a serving platter. You need to see this, I said, showing her the newly acquired honey dipper. She stared at it in astonishment, then at the woman across the room who had donated it. The matching piece? After all this time? I nodded, equally amazed. What are the odds that both would end up back in Pine Ridge, back with the families they were originally connected to? Barbara carefully held the silver piece, examining the craftsmanship that linked it to her husband's ancestor. Do you ever wonder if some things are meant to find their way home? If history has its own way of making itself whole again? The philosophical question surprised me coming from her, the woman who had once been so pragmatic about erasing inconvenient history, now pondering its almost mystical persistence. I don't know, I admitted. But I do think objects hold energy from the people who made and treasured them. Maybe that creates a kind of gravity that pulls related things back together. Over time, as we placed the reunited honey dippers side by side in the exhibition case, I thought about all the forces that had brought us to this moment. Barbara's misguided attempt to erase the Wilson legacy, the hidden cameras that had captured her, betrayal, the painful confrontations and reluctant forgiveness, the unexpected discoveries that had revealed our family's intertwined past. None of it had been easy or straightforward. Yet somehow, through all the hurt and healing, something valuable had emerged. Not just recovered objects, but recovered connections, a more complete understanding of who we were and where we came from. That evening, as the community event wound down, Dr. Levine gathered our extended family for a toast. To the Wilson Parkers, he said, raising his glass, whose journey reminds us that history isn't just about preserving the past, it's about understanding it honestly, with all its complications and contradictions. And to the things that find their way home, Barbara added softly, her gaze meeting mine across the circle. Even when the path takes unexpected turns. As glasses clinked and conversations resumed, I slipped away to the exhibition room for a quiet moment. The displays looked different to me now, not just collections of objects, but physical manifestations of the stories that connected us across time. Caroline Wilson Parker's locket, the matching honey dippers crafted by Richard Parker, great-grandfather's woodworking tools, Civil War letters, each item a thread in the complex tapestry of 2 families that had separated and reunited across generations. I thought about the cameras in my attic, installed in fear and suspicion, now repurposed for documentation and preservation. They had captured a betrayal, yes, but also set in motion a journey of discovery that none of us could have anticipated. Some wounds never fully heal. Some betrayals leave permanent marks. But standing there, surrounded by the tangible evidence of our family's resilience through loss and separation, I understood something important. The legacy worth protecting wasn't just in the objects themselves, but in the willingness to face difficult truths, to acknowledge past wrongs, and to choose connection over resentment whenever possible. Barbara joined me in the exhibition room, her reflection appearing beside mine in the glass display case. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, echoing Ethan's familiar phrase. "I was just thinking about how differently things might have turned out," I admitted. "If I hadn't installed those cameras, if we hadn't discovered the connection between our families." She was quiet for a moment, then said with unexpected candor, I would have continued believing I needed to fabricate a history worth respecting. You would have continued not knowing the full story of your own family. We would all be poorer for it. Her perception surprised me. This acknowledgement that even through the pain of betrayal and confrontation, something valuable had been gained. Strange how things work out, I mused. How sometimes the worst moments lead to unexpected discoveries. Barbara nodded, her gaze fixed on the paired honey dippers in their display. The exhibition catalog quotes your grandfather. Things can be replaced, but stories endure. I think I finally understand what he meant. As we stood there in companionable silence, I realized we had reached a kind of peace. Not perfect forgiveness, not complete healing, but a mutual recognition of the complicated journey that had brought us here and the shared history that would continue to unfold long after we were gone. The cameras in my attic had caught a thief, but in doing so, they had uncovered something far more valuable than any object that could be stolen or sold. The truth of who we were, where we came from, and how our seemingly separate stories had always been parts of a greater whole. Sometimes it seems betrayal can be the beginning of understanding, and sometimes what appears to be an ending is merely a forgotten chapter waiting to be rediscovered. The crisp autumn morning brought a flurry of activity to our home. Megan had gone into labor 3 weeks early, and the entire extended family had mobilized with surprising efficiency. As I packed an overnight bag for her and Greg, Ashley coordinated with the hospital while Ethan made necessary phone calls. Even Uncle David, usually so reserved, was bustling around gathering last-minute items Megan might need. Someone needs to call Barbara, I reminded Ethan as he hung up with Richard. She's at that preservation workshop in Burlington today. He nodded, already dialing. Dad's on his way to pick her up. They'll meet us at the hospital. The fact that Richard and Barbara now functioned as an effective team during family emergencies, despite their separation, was just one of many unexpected developments in our evolving family dynamic. The impending birth of their first grandchild had created a sort of truce between them, not reconciliation, but a mutual commitment to being present without conflict. At Pine Ridge Memorial Hospital, we found Greg pacing the maternity ward waiting room, his usual composure completely abandoned. 8 centimeters already, he announced as we arrived. The doctor says it's progressing quickly for a first baby. As family members settled in for the wait, I found myself studying the assembled group. Wilson and Parker relatives mingled together, their differences less apparent than their shared excitement. Noah helped Uncle David set up a laptop to call Ashley's parents in Arizona. Richard arrived with Barbara, both slightly breathless from rushing bearing flowers and a small stuffed bear. Any news? Barbara asked, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled from the hurried journey. Moving fast, I told her. The nurse said it could be just a couple more hours. Barbara nodded, then hesitated. I brought something. I don't know if it's appropriate, but... She reached into her purse and withdrew a small box. It's a family tradition. At least it was in my family. Inside was a delicate silver baby bracelet, clearly antique. My grandmother gave this to me when Megan was born, she explained. Her mother gave it to her, and so on. I thought, well, with everything we've learned about family connections. The gesture moved me deeply. This wasn't an attempt to overshadow Wilson traditions or insert Parker history where it didn't belong. It was a genuine offering of continuity, a recognition that the child about to be born would inherit legacies from both families. It's perfect, I assured her. Megan will love it. As the hours passed, conversation in the waiting room flowed, more naturally than I would have imagined possible a year earlier. Richard and Uncle David discovered a shared interest in local architecture, leading to an animated discussion about Pine Ridge's historic buildings. Noah showed Barbara how to use a genealogy app he'd developed, helping her input the Parker family information we'd uncovered. Ashley and Ethan reminisced about their own childhood, sharing stories that somehow had never come up before. It struck me how the impending arrival of a new generation had shifted everyone's perspective, how the past suddenly mattered not as a source of conflict, but as a heritage to be preserved and passed on. When Greg finally burst through the doors, his face a mixture of exhaustion and wonder, the entire room held its breath. "It's a girl," he announced. "Olivia Caroline Parker, 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Mom and baby are doing great." The name registered immediately, Olivia for Greg's mother, and Caroline for the woman whose brief marriage had connected our families over a century ago. It was a perfect acknowledgement of the complicated history that had brought us all to this moment. As family members took turns visiting the new mother and baby, I found myself hanging back, watching the interactions with a sense of wonder. Barbara approached the bassinet with uncharacteristic hesitation, her usual confidence replaced by an almost reverent care as Megan placed little Olivia in her arms. Richard stood nearby, his eyes suspiciously bright as he watched his wife, estranged, but not entirely disconnected, hold their granddaughter. "She has the Wilson chin," Barbara observed softly, tracing a gentle finger along the sleeping infant's profile. "And the Parker eyes," Megan added, "Dad's side of the family." The simple acknowledgement that this child carried physical traits from both lineages seemed to touch Barbara deeply. She carefully fastened the silver bracelet around Olivia's tiny wrist, explaining its history to Megan and Greg. "It's been in my family for generations," she said. "Though now, knowing what we do about our family histories..." "It might have Wilson connections too," Megan finished with a smile. "Everything seems to, eventually." Later, as visitors cleared out to let the new family rest, I found myself walking beside Barbara toward the parking lot. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for making space for me today. I know things between us are still complicated." "Family is always complicated," I replied. "But some things are simple. Olivia deserves to know all of her grandparents, all of her heritage." Barbara nodded, her gaze distant. "When I look at her, I see possibilities I never considered before. A chance to do things differently." She hesitated, then added softly, "To be the kind of grandmother I needed instead of the mother I became." The raw honesty of her statement caught me off guard. Barbara Parker had changed significantly through therapy and self-reflection, but she rarely articulated her insights so directly. "That's a powerful perspective," I acknowledged, "breaking cycles instead of repeating them." "It's what you did," she observed. "When I betrayed your trust, you could have responded with equal destruction. Instead, you chose a different path." I hadn't thought of it that way before, hadn't recognized my own choice as breaking a potential cycle of retaliation and hurt. But she was right. The cameras had caught her betrayal, but what I did with that evidence had been entirely up to me. "Maybe that's the real legacy worth preserving," I suggested. "Not just objects or stories, but ways of responding when those things are threatened." Barbara considered this, then offered a tentative smile. "Olivia Caroline is fortunate to have you as a grandmother-in-law. I hope I can learn from your example." As we reached our cars, an unexpected sense of peace settled between us. Not the complete healing of past wounds, but an acknowledgement that moving forward mattered more than looking back. Over the following weeks, baby Olivia became the center of our family universe. The cottage on Maple Street that Barbara had purchased became a regular gathering place, its central location making it convenient for impromptu visits. Richard, though still maintaining his separate residence, was a frequent visitor as well, his relationship with Barbara evolving into something like friendship after decades of a more complicated dynamic. One evening in late November, as the first snow-dusted Pine Ridge, Dr. Levine called with news that would once again shift our understanding of our interconnected family histories. "I've been corresponding with a historical society in Connecticut," he explained. his excitement palpable, even over the phone. They have a collection of business records from a jewelry maker who operated in Hartford from 1920 to 1945. The owner was Joseph Parker II. Richard's grandfather, I confirmed, already intrigued. Yes, and Emma, he specialized in honey-themed pieces, silver and gold work featuring bee motifs, honey dippers, similar designs to what we've seen in Richard Parker's work from Pine Ridge. The connection was unmistakable, further evidence that skills and artistic sensibilities had passed down through generations, even when the family history had been obscured. There's more, Dr. Levine continued. Among their holdings is an unfinished commission from 1942, a silver honey pot with accompanying dippers, intended as a wedding gift. The client who ordered it was named William Wilson. I nearly dropped the phone. My grandfather? I believe so. The address matches your family's former home in Connecticut. According to the records, William Wilson specifically requested bee motifs similar to family pieces he already owned. The implications were staggering. My grandfather had sought out Joseph Parker's craftsmanship, perhaps recognizing something familiar in his work, something that resonated with family treasures already in his possession. Had he known about the connection? Had some memory of shared history persisted despite the separation of our families? The commission was never completed, Dr. Levine explained. Joseph Parker, too, died suddenly in 1942, and the business closed. But the designs exist, along with the partially completed piece. And William Wilson never mentioned this to anyone in our family, I mused. At least not that I'm aware of. Perhaps he didn't know the significance, Dr. Levine suggested. Or perhaps he did, but chose to keep it private. Family histories are often preserved in silence as much as in stories. After hanging up, I sat in Grandpa Henry's reading chair, now restored to its place of honor in our living room, turning this new information over in my mind. If my grandfather had sought out a Parker craftsman, had there been other points of connection between our families that we still didn't know about? How many times had the Wilson and Parker lines nearly reconnected before Ethan and I finally brought them together permanently? I called a family meeting the following weekend to share Dr. Levine's discovery. We gathered at Barbara's cottage, which had become a neutral space for such discussions. As I explained what we'd learned, Richard sat with a stunned expression. My grandfather never spoke about his jewelry business, he said when I finished. I knew he had been a craftsman of some kind, but the details were always vague. My father seemed almost embarrassed by it, preferred to emphasize the more respectable business ventures that came later. Respectable meaning profitable, Barbara observed with newfound insight. Your father measured worth in financial terms, not craftsmanship. Richard nodded slowly. Which is exactly how he raised me. Success meant financial achievement, not artistic expression or personal fulfillment. He looked around at our assembled family. A value system I perpetuated. Without questioning. The self-awareness in his statement reflected his own journey over the past year, parallel to but distinct from Barbara's. While she had been addressing her need for status and control, Richard had been examining the materialistic values that had shaped his life and relationships. What I don't understand, Ethan interjected, is why Grandpa Wilson would seek out a Parker craftsman if he knew about the family connection. Why not just make contact directly? Different times, Uncle David suggested. Family estrangements were often maintained more rigidly back then. But seeking out Joseph's craftsmanship might have been William's way of acknowledging the connection without breaking social conventions. Or maybe he simply recognized quality work that reminded him of family pieces he already owned, Ashley offered pragmatically, without knowing the full significance. Dr. Levine, who had joined us for the discussion, had another perspective. Family histories are rarely as disconnected as they appear on the surface. Throughout human history, separated relatives have found ways to maintain tenuous connections through shared traditions, through patronage of family businesses, through settlement patterns that bring them to the same regions. Like Richard's father moving the family back to Pine Ridge, Noah noted. Perhaps drawn by some subconscious memory or family stories he'd heard. As theories circulated about what William Wilson might have known and why he sought out Joseph Parker's craftsmanship, Barbara quietly excused herself, returning moments later with a dusty photo album. "I found this in Richard's mother's things," she explained, opening to a marked page. I didn't understand its significance until now. The black and white photograph showed a storefront in what appeared to be 1930s Hartford. The sign read, Parker. Fine metalwork, and in the window display, barely visible but unmistakable once pointed out, was a honey dipper with the distinctive bee motif we now recognized as Richard Parker's original design. "Look at the date," Barbara urged, pointing to a notation on the album page. 1939, and look who's in the photograph. Standing in front of the shop was a young man in military uniform, his face bearing the unmistakable Wilson features we all recognized from family photographs. "William Wilson," Uncle David confirmed, studying the image. "My father, before he shipped out to Europe." The photograph was physical evidence of what we'd been theorizing, that William Wilson had not only known about Joseph Parker's business, but had visited it in person. Whether he understood the full family connection remained unclear, but the image confirmed that the separated branches of our family tree had indeed crossed paths before. "So when William later commissioned the honeypot," Richard began, "he knew exactly who he was ordering it from," I finished. "This wasn't random. He deliberately sought out a Parker craftsman." The discovery prompted a new wave of research. Dr. Levine arranged for the Connecticut Historical Society to send detailed photographs of the unfinished honeypot commission, which revealed design elements strikingly similar to the honey dippers we had in our collection. Meanwhile, Uncle David began reviewing William Wilson's personal papers, searching for any mention of the Parkers or acknowledgement of the family connection. What emerged was not a straightforward narrative, but fragments of a more complex story. Hints that William Wilson had known something of his mother Caroline's first marriage, perhaps through stories told by his stepfather Edward Thompson. Notes in William's journal referenced mother's first love and the beekeeper's legacy, suggesting awareness of Richard Parker's existence without explicitly naming him. "I think he knew," Uncle David concluded after weeks of research. "Not the full story perhaps, but enough to recognize the Parker name and seek out Joseph's craftsmanship as a way of acknowledging the connection." "But he never told his children," I pointed out. "Grandpa Henry never mentioned any Parker relatives or connections to me." "Different generation, different sensibilities," Dr. Levine suggested. "Family disruptions, divorce, remarriage, children from multiple marriages carried much stronger social stigma then. William might have known, but chosen to keep it private out of respect for his mother's choices or his stepfather's position." As winter deepened in Pine Ridge, our research expanded beyond William Wilson to other potential points of connection between our families. Noah's genealogical database identified several occasions when Wilsons and Parkers had lived in the same communities, attended the same schools, or worked in related industries, all without apparent acknowledgement of their shared ancestry. "It's like they were orbiting each other across generations," Ashley observed as we reviewed Noah's findings. "Never directly connecting, but never completely separated either." "Until now," Ethan added, glancing toward the nursery where baby Olivia was napping. "The embodiment of our families finally, permanently reunited." The Connecticut Historical Society eventually agreed to loan the unfinished honeypot for our local exhibition. When it arrived, carefully packed and documented, we gathered to examine this tangible evidence of William Wilson's attempted reconnection with his Parker relatives. The piece was beautiful, even in its incomplete state. A silverer vessel with delicate bee motifs around the rim, the same distinctive craftsmanship we'd seen in Richard Parker's original work. The base bore Joseph Parker II's maker's mark, While the design sketches included with it showed William Wilson's specific requests, elements that echoed pieces he already owned, pieces we now recognized as likely having originated with the first Richard Parker. He was trying to complete a set, Richard realized as we studied the sketches, to acquire new pieces that would match family heirlooms passed down from Caroline. A way of making the family whole again through objects, if not through direct acknowledgement, Dr. Levine suggested. For Barbara, who had once sought to separate our family's histories, the evidence of their persistent connection across generations seemed particularly meaningful. No matter how hard anyone tried to erase the connection, it kept resurfacing, she observed, through craftsmanship, through aesthetic preferences, through geographical choices. Through Olivia, Megan added softly, joining us with her daughter in her arms. The baby wore the silver bracelet Barbara had given her, another piece of Parker family history now linked to a new generation that united both lineages. As spring approached, bringing with it Olivia's baptism, our extended family prepared for another milestone event. The ceremony would take place at Pine Ridge Community Church, the same church where Caroline Wilson had married Richard Parker over a century earlier, and later Edward Thompson after Richard's death. The historical symmetry wasn't lost on any of us, nor was the symbolic significance of gathering both families in a place that had witnessed their original connection and subsequent separation. Barbara, who had taken primary responsibility for the reception planning, had worked closely with the church historian to incorporate elements that acknowledged this full history. We found the original marriage register, she explained during our final planning meeting. Caroline and Richard signed it on this exact date in 1901. Caroline and Edward signed it almost exactly 2 years later. Full circle, I murmured, thinking about how our families had separated and reunited across generations. The morning of the baptism dawned clear and bright. As family members gathered at the church, I found myself drawn to the old parish registry, now displayed in a glass case in the vestibule. The careful signatures of Caroline Wilson and Richard Parker were clearly visible on the yellowed page, tangible evidence of the brief union that had connected our families before tragedy and circumstance pulled them apart. Nearby, a newer display featured photographs and documents from our ongoing research, the Wilson-Parker history now officially acknowledged as part of the church's own story. Dr. Levine had written explanatory text that traced the separation and eventual reunion of the two family lines, culminating in baby Olivia's birth. As I studied the display, Barbara joined me, elegantly dressed for her granddaughter's baptism, but with a subdued quality to her appearance that reflected her ongoing personal growth. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" she said quietly. "How much effort went into separating these families, yet here we are, together again." "History has its own gravity," I replied, echoing a phrase Dr. Levine often used. "Drawing related things back together over time." Barbara nodded thoughtfully. "I spent so many years trying to fabricate a distinguished Parker family history, never imagining the real story was actually more compelling than anything I could invent." It was perhaps the most honest assessment she'd ever offered of her previous motivations. This acknowledgement that her attempts to elevate the Parker name through deception had been not just wrong, but unnecessary. The real story had everything, I agreed. Love, loss, separation, reconnection across generations. Much more meaningful than any invented pedigree. As we took our places for the ceremony, I found myself seated beside Richard, with Barbara on his other side. Though still separated as a couple, they had developed a newfound respect that allowed them to function effectively as grandparents. Ethan sat with Megan and Greg in the front pew, while Ashley, Noah, and Uncle David filled in the row behind us. When the minister invited family members to gather around the baptismal font, the same one used when Caroline Wilson had her children, baptized, I was struck by the tableau we created. Wilson and Parker relatives stood shoulder to shoulder, the artificial divisions that had separated us now dissolved by shared purpose and understanding. Olivia Caroline Parker, dressed in a christening gown that incorporated lace from both family collections, gazed around with bright, curious eyes as the minister spoke about heritage, continuity, and the binding power of love across generations. On her tiny wrist, the silver bracelet from Barbara's family caught the light from the stained glass windows, the same windows that had illuminated Caroline Wilson's 2 weddings a century earlier. "This child," the minister declared, "carries forward the legacies of both the Wilson and Parker families, legacies of craftsmanship, resilience, and ultimately reconciliation. May she grow to understand and honor the complex history that brought her into being." As water touched Olivia's forehead and she let out a startled cry, quickly soothed by her mother's embrace, I felt a sense of completion that transcended the day's ceremony. The hidden cameras in my attic had caught Barbara's betrayal, setting in motion a chain of discoveries that had ultimately healed a century-old family separation. Some wounds never fully heal. Some betrayals leave permanent marks. But standing in that church, watching a new generation receive blessings under the same roof where our family's complex journey had begun, I understood something profound about legacy and forgiveness. The true inheritance worth protecting wasn't physical objects that could be stolen or sold, but the capacity to acknowledge hard truths, to learn from painful history, and to choose connection even when separation might seem easier. That was the legacy I hoped Olivia would carry forward. Not just silver bracelets or honey dippers, but the wisdom earned through our family's journey from betrayal to understanding. After the ceremony, as guests gathered at Barbara's cottage, for the reception, I found a moment of quiet in her carefully tended garden. The space reflected her evolving sensibilities, still beautifully maintained but with a more natural aesthetic than the rigidly controlled environments she had once preferred. Richard joined me there, 2 champagne glasses in hand. "For the grandmothers," he explained, offering one to me. "I thought we deserved a private toast." I accepted the glass with a smile, touched by the gesture and the inclusive acknowledgement of my role in Olivia's life. "To family," he suggested, raising his glass, "in all its complicated glory." "To family," I agreed, lost and found and recreated. As we sipped champagne in the spring sunshine, Richard's expression grew thoughtful. "Emma, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. The cameras in your attic, what made you install them in the first place? What made you suspicious enough to take that step?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because so much had happened since those early days that I rarely thought about my initial motivations anymore. "Trust your instincts," I said after a moment. That's what Grandpa Henry always told me. When small things started disappearing from the attic, something felt wrong. Not just the missing items, but the explanations that never quite made sense. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Barbara was always so convincing. I believed her explanations for decades, about expenses, about family conflicts, about why certain relationships needed to be limited or controlled. "It's not easy to recognize manipulation when it comes from someone you love," I acknowledged. "No, it isn't," he agreed quietly, "which is why I've always respected how quickly you acted on your suspicions. You protected what mattered to you, even when doing so was difficult and complicated." His words made me reconsider my own actions in a new light. Installing those cameras hadn't just been about catching a thief. It had been an act of self-trust, a refusal to dismiss my own concerns even when doing so would have been easier. "Sometimes protection looks like confrontation," I observed, "even when that's uncomfortable." Richard raised his glass again. "To uncomfortable truths, then. And the courage to face them." As we rejoined the gathering inside, where Barbara was showing Dr. Levine a newly discovered Parker family photograph, I felt an unexpected sense of gratitude for the painful journey of the past year and a half. The betrayal, caught on camera, had forced a reckoning, not just with Barbara's actions, but with both families' histories of separation, silence, and selective remembering. Perhaps that was the most valuable legacy of all, not the objects we'd recovered or the historical connections we'd discovered, but the hard-won wisdom that came from facing difficult truths and choosing to build something new from their acknowledgement. And as I watched Olivia being passed from one family member to another, her baptismal gown incorporating elements from both the Wilson and Parker histories, I understood that legacy isn't something static to be preserved unchanged, but something living that evolves with each generation's efforts to honor the past while creating their own future. The cameras in my attic had caught a thief, but they had also captured the beginning of a journey home, not to any physical place, but to the truth of who we were and where we came from. A journey that would continue long after the betrayal that started it had faded into just another chapter in our family's complex, resilient story. 2 years after Olivia's baptism, I stood in my attic, now a properly climate-controlled archive space, carefully wrapping the last items for what had become an annual tradition. The Wilson Parker Traveling Exhibition would begin its third tour next week, this time expanding beyond neighboring towns to include stops at 3 small museums across the state. Need any help with those? Ethan called from the stairs, balancing a tray of coffee mugs. Just finishing up, I replied, accepting a steaming mug gratefully. Dr. Levine is arriving in an hour to review the final selections. The exhibition had grown significantly from its humble beginnings. What started as a local display of recovered family items had evolved into a broader exploration of how family histories are preserved, lost, and sometimes deliberately obscured across generations. Museums had taken interest not just in our specific story, but in the universal themes it represented. The persistence of family connections despite separation, the way craftsmanship and aesthetic preferences travel through bloodlines even when the stories behind them are forgotten. Mom called, Ethan mentioned, helping me label the final box. She's finished the companion piece for the honey pot. This was perhaps the most unexpected development of the past year. Barbara, whose therapy had led her to explore healthier outlets for her perfectionism, had taken up silversmithing, studying the techniques that had been passed down through generations of Parkers. Working from Joseph Parker II's original designs, she had committed to completing the honey pot that William Wilson had commissioned 8 decades earlier. Is she pleased with it? I asked, genuinely curious. Barbara's craftsmanship had improved, remarkably over months of dedicated practice, guided by an artisan from Burlington who specialized in traditional metalworking techniques. She says it's not perfect, Ethan replied with a knowing smile. But it's authentic, which matters more. The distinction was significant, evidence of Barbara's continued growth away from superficial perfection toward genuine value. The completed honey pot wouldn't precisely match what Joseph Parker II would have created, but it represented something more meaningful, Barbara's commitment to honoring, rather than appropriating family history. Our doorbell rang, announcing Dr. Levine's arrival. Now officially retired from his university position, he had devoted himself fully to documenting the Wilson Parker history, a project that had expanded to include research on other Pine Ridge families whose stories had been similarly fragmented by time and circumstance. Emma, Ethan, he greeted us warmly. I've brought something remarkable to show you before we finalize the exhibition selections. Over coffee at our dining table, he carefully unfolded a document protected in an archival sleeve, a letter dated 1945, written in a shaky hand on War Department stationery. This was in a collection recently donated to the state archives, he explained. Letters from servicemen stationed in Europe during the final months of World War II. This one was written by William Wilson to his son Henry. My breath caught. Grandpa Henry had rarely spoken about his father's wartime service, and I'd never seen any correspondence from that period. May I asked, reaching for the letter with careful hands. Dr. Levine nodded. It's a copy, made, with the archive's permission. I thought you should see it before deciding whether to include it in the exhibition. The letter began conventionally enough, a father's update to his son about his location and health, cautious references to military operations that wouldn't trigger censors. But the final paragraphs made my heart race. I've been thinking much about family lately, as men do when facing mortality daily. There are things I've never told you about your grandmother Caroline, about her life before she married Edward Thompson. She was briefly married to a man named Richard Parker, who died young. They had a son, your half-uncle Joseph, who now lives in Connecticut with his family. I've kept track of him over the years, though we've never spoken. Pride and circumstance kept our families separate, a division I've come to regret as I see the fragility of life here. If I don't return home, there is a silver honey pot being made by Joseph's son in Hartford, commissioned before I shipped out. It was to be my way of acknowledging the connection, however belatedly. If it is completed, I hope you will receive it and understand its significance. Some family separations are necessary, but others are merely the result of stubbornness and misunderstanding. The Parkers are your blood too, Henry. Remember that. The letter continued with more conventional closing sentiments, but my hands trembled as I passed it to Ethan. He knew everything, I whispered, and he wanted Grandpa Henry to know too. But the honeypot was never completed, Ethan noted, scanning the letter. Joseph Parker, too, died before finishing it. And William survived the war, Dr. Levine added. So perhaps he felt the urgency had passed. Or perhaps he tried to tell Henry in person but couldn't find the right way. I thought about my grandfather, his careful preservation of family history, his emphasis on protecting our legacy. Had he known about the Parker connection all along? Had he tried, in his own subtle way, to prepare me for a truth he'd never fully articulated? This changes the narrative significantly, Dr. Levine observed. Not a story of families completely separated by tragedy, but of individuals making conscious choices about how much of their history to acknowledge or conceal. Choices that affected generations, I added, thinking about how differently things might have unfolded if William's attempt at reconnection had succeeded, if Grandpa Henry had known about his Parker relatives, if Barbara had understood the true history she was trying to erase. As we finalized selections for the traveling exhibition, William's letter added a poignant new dimension to our family story. Dr. Levine suggested creating a special display around the theme of attempted reconnections, featuring the letter, the unfinished honeypot, and now Barbara's companion piece, symbols of efforts across generations to bridge the divide between our families. That evening, we gathered at Barbara's cottage to share the letter with the extended family. Richard sat quietly as Uncle David read it aloud, his expression revealing complex emotions as he learned of William Wilson's awareness of his father's existence. All those years, he said finally. They knew about each other but never spoke. Different times, Uncle David reminded him. Family separations were handled differently then, but William clearly wanted to change that in his own way. Barbara, who had been listening intently, spoke up. The honeypot I've been working on. It's not just a craft project, is it? It's completing something that started decades ago. A circle closing, Dr. Levine agreed, though perhaps not in the way William Wilson envisioned. When Barbara unveiled her completed piece the following day, the symmetry was undeniable. Using Joseph Parker II's original designs and incorporating elements from Richard Parker's earlier work, she had created a honeypot that honored the craftsmanship tradition of both men, while reflecting her own developing style. It wasn't a perfect replica of what Joseph would have created, but it carried the same essential spirit. The distinctive bee motifs, the balanced proportions, the attention to functional details. It's beautiful, I told her sincerely, examining the finished piece. The silverwork wasn't flawless, bearing small evidence of a still developing technique, but those slight imperfections gave it character, a human quality that perfectly suited the story behind it. I kept thinking about William while I worked on it, Barbara admitted. How he reached out across that family divide in the midst of war, knowing he might never return home. How much courage that must have taken. Her perception surprised me. This empathetic connection to a man she'd never met, whose attempt at family reconciliation paralleled our own journey in unexpected ways. The traveling exhibition opened the following week at the Pine Ridge Historical Society before embarking on its expanded tour. The central display now incorporated William's letter alongside the original honey dippers, Caroline's locket, the E.T. unfinished honeypot from Joseph Parker II, and Barbara's companion piece, physical manifestations of a family story that spanned more than a century. From separation to reunion, read the exhibition text Dr. Levine had written. The Wilson-Parker family journey illuminates how the past is never truly lost, merely waiting to be rediscovered when we're ready to see it clearly. As visitors moved through the exhibition on opening night, I watched Barbara explaining the silver-working techniques to an interested group. She handled questions about her craftsmanship with newfound humility, freely acknowledging her status as a beginner while showing genuine pride in what she had accomplished. "Your mother-in-law has come a long way," Uncle David observed, joining me by the display. "Hard to reconcile with the woman who threw away your family heirlooms." "People can change," I replied, "when they're willing to face difficult truths about themselves." The transformation hadn't been instantaneous or simple. Barbara's journey from destructive perfectionism to creative growth had included relapses, setbacks, and moments when old patterns reasserted themselves. But the overall trajectory had been toward healing, not just for her, but for all of us, affected by her actions. Richard approached, champagne glasses in hand. "A toast to the exhibition's send-off," he suggested, handing us each a glass. "And to William Wilson's letter finally reaching its intended recipients, even if decades late." As we raised our glasses, I caught sight of the security cameras discreetly positioned throughout the exhibition space, standard museum practice to protect valuable items. So different from the hidden cameras I'd installed in our attic out of suspicion and fear, yet serving a similar protective purpose. From hidden cameras catching deception to visible ones preserving history, I mused, putting my observation into words. "It feels symbolically appropriate." Uncle David chuckled. "Always the poet in the family. But you're right. There's something fitting about it." Later that evening, as the opening reception wound down, I found myself alone with the exhibition's centerpiece, the tableau of objects representing our family's journey from separation to reunion. Standing before Caroline's locket, the paired honey dippers, the unfinished and now companion honey pots, I felt the weight of history in a tangible way. Dr. Levine joined me, his scholarly enthusiasm tempered by genuine affection for our family, after years of collaboration. "You know what strikes me most about your story?" he asked. "How often family histories are shaped not just by what happened, but by what people choose to remember and share. Or choose to forget and conceal," I added. He nodded thoughtfully. "William knew about the Parker connection, but didn't fully share it with Henry. Henry may have known something but didn't pass it on to you directly. Barbara tried to erase your family's history, but ended up uncovering a deeper connection instead. And now we're deliberately preserving and sharing all of it," I concluded. "The full, complicated truth. That's what makes this exhibition so compelling," Dr. Levine observed. "It's not just about objects or even people. It's about how family stories evolve across generations, shaped by each person's choices about what to acknowledge or deny." As the exhibition embarked on its tour the following week, those choices continued to resonate through our family in unexpected ways. Richard, inspired by William's wartime letter, began researching his father's military service, discovering connections to Pine Ridge veterans that further rooted the Parker family in local history. Barbara's silversmithing evolved from therapeutic hobby to genuine passion as she studied historical techniques and incorporated them into contemporary designs. Most significantly, Megan and Greg announced they were expecting their second child, a boy this time, to be named William Richard Parker, honoring both family lines. The announcement, made at a Sunday dinner at the Wilson cabin, brought tears to Richard's eyes and a quiet smile to Barbara's face. Acknowledgement of their shared legacy continuing into a new generation. "I've been thinking," Barbara said later, that evening as we sat on the cabin's porch watching fireflies emerge in the summer twilight, "about starting a scholarship at the community college." "What kind of scholarship?" I asked, genuinely curious. "For historical preservation," she replied. "Specifically for projects focused on uncovering and documenting family histories that have been fragmented or lost, especially for families who don't have the resources to research their roots themselves." The thoughtfulness of the proposal moved me. This recognition that our family's journey of discovery had been facilitated by privilege, by access to resources and experts that many lacked. "That's a wonderful idea," I told her sincerely. "A way of extending what we've learned beyond just our own family story." Barbara nodded, her gaze fixed on the gathering darkness. "I spent so many years trying to fabricate a distinguished history for the Parkers. Now I understand that every family's real story is worth preserving, exactly as it is, with all its complications and contradictions." It was perhaps the most profound evidence of her transformation. This shift from seeing family history as a status symbol to recognizing it as a fundamental human right, the knowledge of where we come from and how we connect to those who came before us. The Wilson Parker Family History Scholarship was established that fall, providing funding for 3 students annually to pursue projects documenting previously unrecorded aspects of local family histories. The first recipients focused on immigrant families whose stories had been altered or simplified in official records, Native American lineages disrupted by government policies, and African American families whose histories had been obscured by slavery and its aftermath. "This feels right," Barbara told me at the scholarship announcement ceremony. "Using what we've learned to help others recover their own histories." As the students presented their initial research findings, I thought about how our family story had expanded beyond its original boundaries, no longer just about recovered heirlooms or discovered connections, but about the broader significance of preserving history in all its complexity. The traveling exhibition returned to Pine Ridge the following spring, enriched by responses and contributions from the communities it had visited. Local families had added their own stories of separation and reunion, creating a tapestry of experiences that contextualized our particular journey within a broader human pattern. On the exhibition's final day, 3 generations of Wilson Parkers gathered for a private viewing, from Uncle David and Richard representing the older generation to little Olivia and her baby brother William representing the newest. Barbara had created a special display for the occasion, silver napkin rings for each family member, each bearing the combined Wilson Parker bee motif that had become our family's unofficial symbol. "A new tradition," she explained as she presented them. "Not to replace the historical pieces, but to complement them. Something created specifically for our reconnected family." The gesture embodied everything she had learned. That family legacy isn't just about preserving what already exists, but about creating new traditions that honor the past while acknowledging the present reality. As our extended family moved through the exhibition together, I found myself watching the interactions more than the displays. Uncle David showing Olivia how to recognize Richard Parker's distinctive silverwork, Megan documenting everything on video for a family archive, Ashley and Noah explaining to their newly adopted son how families can be formed through choice as well as blood. "Penny for your thoughts," Ethan said, finding me observing from a quiet corner. "I was just thinking about those cameras in our attic," I admitted. "How something I installed out of fear led to all of this." I gestured toward our assembled family, toward the exhibition that had touched so many beyond our immediate circle. "The best kind of unintended consequence," he suggested with a smile. "Yes," I agreed. Though sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't caught Barbara that day, if the betrayal had remained undiscovered. "We might never have learned about our shared history," Ethan acknowledged. "But I think time has its own way of revealing important truths. The connection between our families kept resurfacing across generations despite efforts to obscure it. William's letter might have eventually been found, or Grandpa Henry's recipes, or some other clue. There was wisdom in his perspective, this sense that significant truths possess their own kind of persistence, emerging when the time is right, despite human efforts to conceal them. As the museum closed its doors on the final day of the exhibition, our family gathered at the Wilson cabin for a celebration that felt like both an ending and a beginning. The items that had been on display would return to our climate-controlled attic archive, but their stories had now been shared with hundreds of people across the state. The scholarship recipients would continue their research, uncovering family histories that might otherwise remain hidden. And little William Richard Parker, just beginning to crawl, represented the continuation of our family story into the future. "I've been thinking," Barbara said as we sat around the fire pit in the gathering darkness, "about what to do with the cottage on Maple Street." In recent months, she and Richard had cautiously begun rebuilding their relationship, not returning to their former marriage, but creating something new based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Richard had sold his Burlington apartment and moved into a smaller home nearby, a sign of commitment to remaining in each other's lives without attempting to recreate what had been. "I'm considering donating it to the Historical Society," she continued. "As a research center for family history projects? The location is perfect. Walking distance from the main building, but with enough space for archives and work areas." The suggestion revealed how completely her perspective had shifted, from using property as a status symbol to seeing it as a resource that could benefit the broader community. "That's a wonderful idea," Dr. Levine enthused. "The Society has been searching for expansion space for years." As plans for the research center took shape over the following months, I found myself increasingly involved in its development, drawing on my experience creating our home archive to help design preservation spaces and research facilities. What had begun as a personal project to protect my family's treasures had evolved into a community resource that would help others discover and preserve their own histories. On the day the Wilson Parker Family History Center officially opened, I stood with Barbara on the front porch of what had once been her cottage, watching as visitors explored the transformed space. The main floor now housed research stations and digital archiving equipment, while upstairs, rooms had been converted to climate-controlled storage for fragile documents and artifacts. "Could you ever have imagined this?" I asked her, genuinely curious about how she viewed the journey from that day in my attic to this moment of community celebration. She shook her head, a wry smile playing at her lips. "When I took those items from your attic, I thought I was simplifying our lives, removing complications, creating a cleaner narrative. Instead, I set in motion the exact opposite, the recovery of a complex, messy, wonderful family history that neither of us knew existed." Her self-awareness was hard-won, the product of years of therapy and difficult self-examination. The woman who had once sought to erase inconvenient history now dedicated herself to preserving it in all its complexity. "Life has a way of revealing what's meant to be known," I observed. Despite our best efforts to control the narrative, inside the center, a special display highlighted the Wilson Parker story that had inspired its creation, not as the only or most important family history, but as an example of how separated narratives can be reunited through persistence and openness to difficult truths. Beside Caroline Wilson Parker's locket and the paired honey dippers that had started our journey of discovery stood a new item, a small security camera, tastefully mounted on a display stand. The accompanying text explained its significance. This camera, originally installed to catch a thief, instead captured the beginning of a journey toward historical recovery and family reconciliation. It reminds us that sometimes the tools of suspicion can become instruments of revelation. As I studied the display, Richard joined me, his expression thoughtful. "You know what strikes me most about our family story?" he said. "How often the most meaningful discoveries come from moments of conflict or betrayal. If Barbara hadn't taken those items, if you hadn't installed those cameras, we might never have found our way back to the truth," I finished for him. "Exactly. It makes me wonder how many other family separations could be healed if people were willing to face difficult truths instead of maintaining comfortable silences." His observation captured something essential about our journey, that healing had required not just forgiveness after betrayal, but a willingness to examine the deeper patterns that had allowed that betrayal to occur in the first place. As the center's opening day drew to a close, our extended family gathered once more in what had been Barbara's garden, now transformed into a contemplative space for visitors researching their own histories. Standing in the fading light, surrounded by 3 generations of Wilson Parkers, I felt the weight and wonder of our journey, from broken trust to renewed connection, from forgotten history to deliberate remembering. "I have something for each of you," Barbara announced, distributing small velvet pouches. Inside mine was a silver bookmark, engraved with the bee motif that had become our family symbol, my name on one side and Guardian of Stories on the other. "I made one for each of us," she explained, "with a title that reflects our role in preserving our family history." Richard's read, "Keeper of Connections." Uncle David's, "Memory of Generations." Ethan's, "Bridge Between Families." Each thoughtfully acknowledged the particular contribution that person had made to our shared journey. For the children, Olivia, William, and Ashley's adopted son Michael, she had created simpler versions with just their names and birth dates, to be elaborated as they grew into their own roles within the family story. "So they'll always know where they came from," Barbara explained, "but remain free to determine where they're going." It was perhaps the most profound evidence of her transformation. This recognition that family legacy isn't something rigid to be controlled, but something living that evolves with each generation's understanding and choices. As darkness fell, and lanterns illuminated the garden, I thought about the cameras in my attic, installed out of suspicion, now repurposed for documentation and preservation. Like our family itself, they had been transformed by the journey from betrayal to understanding, their purpose redefined by the larger story they had unexpectedly helped to tell. William Wilson's letter to his son Henry had expressed a hope that family separations based on stubbornness and misunderstanding might someday be healed. Looking around at our gathered family, Wilson and Parker descendants finally reunited after a century of separation, I felt the realization of that hope, however delayed and circuitous the path to its fulfillment had been. The cameras in my attic had caught a thief, but far more importantly, they had captured the beginning of a journey home, not to any physical place, but to the truth of who we were and where we came from. A journey that would continue through generations yet unborn, who would inherit not just silver objects with bee motifs, but the harder-won legacy of honesty, reconciliation, and the courage to face difficult truths. That, I realized, was the true inheritance worth protecting. Not objects that could be stolen or sold, but the stories that connect us to our past and to each other, in all their complex, imperfect glory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.